Chapter 15. Afloat and Ashore. One of the first things my father did after we returned to Ontario to live was to give substance to a 10-year-old dream. He bought a ship. It was not a canoe this time. It was a real ship, a vessel to make any sailor proud. She came from Montreal, and she was a double-ender of a type designed originally in Norway for service on the North Atlantic, and called a redningskoit. She was big and black and strong, and was well developed as the big-boned, deep-bosomed, buxom Western women that father used to talk nostalgically about. She was ketch-rigged. Her sails were made in Lunenburg and tanned a glowing red. Everything about her was solid and easygoing. My father sailed her up from Montreal single-handedly, and when she arrived among the varnish and mahogany yachts at Toronto, yachts that sometimes flew streamers of ticker tape from their spars instead of pennants, she seemed as out of place as an Aberdeen Angus among a herd of fallow deer. The natty lads in their cream flannels and yachtsmen's hats were inclined to sneer at her, and when they read her name, they laughed out loud. "Scotch bonnet," they cried. "What kind of a name is that for a boat? Why don't you call her Raymar, or Billie Jean, or Saucy Sue 8 like the rest of us?" But when they saw our yachting hats, Balmorals, imported directly from Caithness, they realized that we were beyond their ken entirely, and they ignored us from then on. Scotch bonnet did not care. She knew where her name came from, and she was proud of it. For the black granite reef that rises out of Lake Ontario below Prince Edward County and that bears the name Scotch Bonnet Rock is a place that once loomed large in the minds of real sailormen who manned the grain schooners that owned the Great Lakes in the days before steam drove them into limbo. Scotch Bonnet was, and is, a ship to inspire a deep affection in her crew, and even Mutt was not immune to her attractions. He did not come to her as a complete landlubber, for he had sailed before in Conception. Nevertheless, his first sail aboard Scotch Bonnet might well have turned a lesser dog against the sea forever. In the first week of September, my father announced that he and I and Mutt would take the vessel down the lake to the Bay of Quinte. We drove from our house in the anchorage outside of Toronto's breakwater, and when we arrived there, we found a gale to greet us. The storm warnings were flying, the seas running in across the 40 miles of open water were thundering against the concrete barriers along the shore. It was all we could do to stay afloat in our little dinghy as we rowed out to where a ship lay at her moorings. But Mutt appeared to enjoy the experience, and he was full of enthusiasm as he leaped up to Scotch Bonnet's sturdy deck. We had no sooner run up the mizzen, preparatory to letting slip our moorings, when a police launch came pounding out towards us. It was a big power cruiser, but like all of its species, designed for mill ponds. I watched in awe as it wallowed and heaved across the protected waters, and I was more than half inclined to heed the warnings shouted to us over a loud hailer when the launch came alongside. "Ahoy there!" bawled an authoritative voice. "You can't go outside today. The gale warnings are up." Father, who knew how to handle policemen, simply smiled and answered them in Gaelic. The policemen were game, and they made several attempts to get through to him, but finally they took a big wave broadside and came near enough to swamping to make them decide to leave us foreigners to our fate. Father caught sight of my face. "Buck up," he yelled over the roar of the wind. "Scotch Bonnet's sister ship crossed the Atlantic twice. This is only a light breed for a redningskoit. Now stand by to let slip the moorings while I get a jib up." I stood by, but not very happily. A few moments later, Bonnet was underway, and the water was whooshing beneath her forefoot like a mountain cascade. We went out through the gap into the open lake, under mizzen and jib alone, and there was more than enough canvas in that wind. We had no sooner cleared Toronto Island when we saw a strange spectacle ahead of us. It looked at first as if a drunken forest was staggering toward us out of the storm darkness. We stared perplexed at this phenomenon until my father recognized its meaning. "Look," he whooped joyfully, "that's the Cross Lake race from Rochester, the yachting boys, and they're running for shelter under bare poles." As we stood out toward them, we could see that they certainly were a naked lot. There was hardly a stitch of canvas set on any of those 24 boats, not even on the big 8-meter boats. They were a frightening sight, too, for they were burying their noses until the water ran green the full length of their decks, and their cockpits were no more than private swimming pools. Father was not really a vindictive man, but I suppose he could not resist the impulse. "Take the tiller," he yelled, and with that he began hoisting our great red mainsail. We drove through that battered fleet like another Flying Dutchman. As we passed, we sang, "It's up with the bonnets of Bonnibont Dundee" at the top of our lungs. It was an exhilarating moment, but when we had come about and were beating eastward down the coast, I remembered that I had not seen Mutt for half an hour. I went below to seek him. I found him up on my bunk, up forward of the mainmast where the motion was the worst. He was stretched at full length, his head on my pillow and his feet hanging limply over the side of the bunk. He looked as if he believed and hoped that he was already dead. He took no notice of my arrival except to roll his eyes until the sight of those bloodshot orbs made me think suddenly of my own stomach, and I hastened out on deck again. I told my father that Mutt was dying. "He'll get over it," my father said. And of course he did. By dawn he was up and we were around again. But in future, when the storm warnings were flying, he never showed quite the same enthusiasm for sailing as had been on that first day we went to sea. The kind of cruising that really suited Mutt was when we lay at anchor in one or another of the many delightful little coves that hide under the high shores of Prince Edward County. He could then enjoy the best of two worlds. We used to tie the dinghy close alongside Scotch Bonnet, and whenever Mutt felt like stretching his legs on land, he had but to jump into the dinghy, lower himself over its side, and swim ashore. The coves where we chose to lie were usually remote and rather wild, and Mutt could indulge in one of his favourite sports, crayfish hunting, to his heart's content. Crayfish hunting is an aquatic sport. To play it, Mutt would wade out from shore until he stood shoulder deep. Then he would lower his head below the surface, and with his eyes wide open, he would search for the flat stones under which crayfish like to hide. He used his nose to overturn the stones, the water so clear that he could see his quarry scuttling away in search of a new haven. Being members of the lobster family, crayfish have formidable claws, but these availed them nothing against Mutt, who would snap at them with his front teeth until they were disarmed. Once they had been rendered harmless, he would take them in his mouth, raise his head out of the water, and eat them with evident relish. Mutt in his crayfishing was quite a sight to see, and I've known a Bay of Quinte farmer to stand and watch for a solid hour while the plough team pawed restively at the furrowed ground behind him. If crayfish were not abundant, or if the cove happened to be marshy, Mutt would hunt frogs instead. He did this purely for fun, since he never ate the frogs he caught. Nor would he catch a frog while it was on dry land. The trick was to chivvy it into and under the water and try to locate it as it huddled on the bottom. Then Mutt's head would dart down with speed and precision equal to that of his great competitor, the great blue heron, and generally he would emerge with the frog held gently in his jaws. He would carry it to land, release it, and then chase it back into the water for another round. If he grew tired of the land, or if he fell afoul of a farmer as a result of his old passion for cattle chasing, Mutt had only to plunge into the cove and swim out to the dinghy again. It was a life that suited him ideally. It was ideal for me as well, but I preferred Scotch Bonnet under sail, making her way in fine weather among the islands and channels of the bay. I held a bird banding permit at the time, and the myriad islets and sandbars around Prince Edward County were densely occupied by breeding colonies of gulls and terns. Scotch Bonnet eventually carried me to almost all these breeding places, and I banded well over 1,000 fledglings in the course of 2 summer cruises. The most memorable of these banding excursions was the one we made to Scotch Bonnet's namesake. Scotch Bonnet lies 9 miles off the Prince Edward shore, and the lighthouse that stands upon it is no longer tended by a keeper. The rock is only visited once or twice each season, when the gas cylinder of the automatic light needs replenishing. Free from human interference, vast flocks of gulls and cormorants now make the rock their home and breeding place. We came to the island from seaward on a boisterous June day with a stiff breeze filling our sails and a brilliant sun beating down upon the rising waves. Because of the heavy seas and strengthening breeze, Father was forced to lie off and under sail, beating back and forth while I rowed ashore in the dinghy. Mutt insisted on coming with me, for we had been some time from land and he was suffering from a lack of trees. It was a hard pull. The sea was steep and choppy, and the little dinghy rose and fell so that often I could not see neither the island nor the vessel. But I could see the cormorants, black and heavy, in slow flight from their fishing grounds to their nests upon the island. I landed on the lee side and hauled the dinghy clear of the swell. All about me gulls rose in angry protest, and since the wind was sweeping across the island full into my face, I was doubly aware that the place was heavily populated. Mutt dashed off to seek a tree, but because there was none, and after some indecision, he finally betook himself to the lighthouse, which must surely have been the most grandiose post ever to greet the eye of a hard-pressed dog. Banding young cormorants is no job for those with weak stomachs. The fledglings are naked until they are more than half grown, and their long necks and ungainly bellies do not make for much aesthetic charm. The nests are sketchy constructions, littered with fish offal and guano. When approached by one whom they suspect, young cormorants fix the intruder with a reproachful gaze, and after letting him come within easy range, suddenly convulse themselves, regurgitating their dinners of partially digested fish at him. Knowing of this deplorable habit, I approached my victims cautiously. Mutt, on the other hand, had no foreknowledge. Having finished his business at the lighthouse, he began picking his way through the nesting area toward me. At first he avoided the young cormorants, but his curiosity got the better of him, and at length he approached one of them with nose outstretched in a tentative gesture of friendship. The cormorant promptly convulsed itself and caught Mutt squarely in the face. I was roused from my work by his cry of outrage, and I stood up in time to see him come dashing blindly through the center of the colony, recklessly steering a direct course and presenting an irresistible target to every young cormorant along the way. He saw me and altered course in my direction, but friendship and brotherly love had their limits, and I climbed hurriedly upon a rock outcropping where I was beyond his reach. He paused briefly at the foot of the rock, fixed me with a terrible look of reproach, and then turning to the island shore, he incontinently flung himself into the lake. I had a hard time launching the dinghy, and by the time I was clear of the shore breakers, I could see no sign of Mutt. As the little boat hung momentarily at the top of each swell, I scanned the waters. At last I caught a glimpse of his black head, and I could see that he was making directly for the mainland shore, 9 miles away. He vanished immediately from my view, but some of his erstwhile enemies from the island now came to his assistance. A bevy of gulls swooped screaming down to him, giving me an aiming mark. Father had seen me leave the island, and he realized that all was not well. He brought the vessel about, and he bore down on me. I waved towards the gulls, and he understood at once, for he could see that Mutt was missing from the dinghy. Mutt had to be dragged aboard the ship, and he showed no signs of gratitude for his rescue. The swim had cleansed his body, but the memory of the indignity he had suffered remained upon him. He crawled into a cubbyhole under the cockpit seat, and there he stayed through the remainder of the day and emerged, tentatively, only when we docked in the Murray Canal that evening. Even then he did not hurry ashore as was his wont, but stood on deck for a long time, suspiciously eyeing the green meadows and inviting trees. Mutt found long passages trying. We were never able to convince him that it was all right with us if he made use of the masts in lieu of telephone poles. While he remained at sea, he steadfastly refused to let nature take a course, either because he felt Scotch bonnet was, in effect, a house, and he was so well housebroken that he could not forget it, or because the motion of the ship made it awkward, if not impossible, for him to balance on 3 legs. Consequently, when we approached our landfall after a long period at sea, Mutt would be extremely anxious to make contact. He could smell the land long before we could see it, and when he began to fidget and whine and stare longingly at the horizon, we knew that shore would soon appear. One summer, our whole family sailed down the lake from Niagara with Kingston as our destination, and because of light airs, we were at sea for almost 36 hours. When Kingston finally hove in sight, Mutt could hardly contain himself. Kingston was built in the earliest days of Upper Canada and retains much of the staid Victorianism of its heyday. Its rows upon rows of grey stone houses reflect a kind of grey stone mentality. We came into the harbour, and even before we got our lines ashore, Mutt had spanned the gap between Scotch bonnet and the dock with a prodigious leap and was away. There was no trees immediately at hand, so he raced up the old cobble street toward the town proper. A seedy gentleman took our lines, and after we were fast, he invited himself aboard, saying that he was an old sailor, a gambit that always worked on my father. We gave him a drink, and after a while he said, "Allow you got a dog." We allowed that we had indeed. "Best keep him tight aboard, then," the old fellow continued. "Here's some terrible things about them young medical students up at the university. They be awful hard on dogs." "What do they do to them?" I asked in my innocence. The old man spat and helped himself to another drink. "Terrible things they do," was all that he could say. I asked where they got the dogs, and he replied that most of them came from the city pound. "I should have had that job, dog catcher," he explained in a grieved tone. "Only I'm a liberal, and this here's a conservative sort of place. Would have kept me good, too. $10 for a dog and 5 for a cat. That's what them students pay." Father cast a slightly anxious look up on the docks, but there was no sign of Mutt. "I don't suppose," he asked the old man somewhat apprehensively, "that there's any law against dogs running loose in Kingston?" The old man snorted. "Law? Sure there's a law. Not that the feller who's dog catcher now needs no dang law. He'll snatch them right out of the backyard, chain and all." Grumbling to himself, the old man left us, but before he was off the dock, we had passed him. We were in a hurry. I went up the dock road, while Father went east along the waterfront, and Mother went west. None of the people I accosted had seen anything that answered Mutt's description, nor could I find any trace of him myself. When I returned to the dock an hour later, it was to discover that neither Father nor Mother had any better luck. My father began to seethe. The thought of Mutt in the toils of the local dog catcher, perhaps already on his way to the dissection table, was enlarging his adrenal glands. "You borrow a bicycle from the boatyard and go looking," he told me. "I'm going to the pound." By the time he reached the pound, he had worked himself into a towering rage, but the dog catcher was not there. In his stead was an emaciated and gum-chewing youth sprawled in an old chair, reading a racing form. He listened without emotion, to father's request that Mutt be released upon the instant. Eventually, he waved a languid hand towards the wire enclosure at the rear of the building. "If your dog's there, you can have him for $2, mister," he said. "Say, you think Red Apple has a chance in the King's Plate?" Not trusting himself to reply, father hurried to the enclosure, only to be confronted by an ominous lack of dogs. There was not one in the whole pound. He returned to the youth and in a voice that raised the languid one out of his chair, demanded the dog catcher himself. The youth grew impertinent. "Try making like a dog then," Mystery advised. "Run out by the university. He'll pick you up somewhere along the way." If the lad had guessed how close he was to annihilation in that instant, he would have discarded the racing form forever in favor of the New Testament. It was only the fact that my father could not afford time for diversion that saved his skin. Outside the pound, father caught a taxi and went straight to City Hall. He tried the mayor's office first, but that gentleman was out of town, attending a conference on sewage disposal. However, the office of the chief of police was close at hand, and father stormed it as he might have stormed any redoubt. He found no one there except a large, fat constable who was very unsympathetic and inclined to quick hostility. Very much on his dignity, the constable pointed out that he did not run the dog pound, and that in any case, father was committing a felony by allowing his dog to run large. The librarian and my father came to the surface immediately. "Run at large," he snapped. The constable was no grammarian. "You better run outside," he said, "or by Hades, I'll run you in." Abandoning any hope of help from the civil power, father now sought a telephone booth and dialed the medical building of the university. The phone rang and rang with that mechanical insistence which indicates either no one is home, or if they are, that they're too busy to bother answering. Father suspected that they were too busy. Ghastly visions of a trussed-up mutt being set upon by white-clad figures assailed him. He did not even wait to get his nickel back, but slammed out of the booth, for he had remembered there was one place in Kingston where he might find aid and friends: the military barracks. When he burst into the officers' mess, he found it deserted, save for the orderly officer of the day, who by singular coincidence had served with father the 4th Battalion during the First World War. This officer was delighted to see an old friend, particularly so since there's nothing duller than orderly duty in a peacetime barracks. He listened with sympathy, and with a quickening gleam in his eyes, father, having downed a quick one, poured out his story. When the tale was told, the officer slapped father affectionately on the shoulder, exclaimed, "Trust the damn civilians to pull a black, eh? This is an emergency, old boy. Tell you what, we'll call the guards and stage a proper rescue." He was as good as his word, and 5 minutes later, a picket of armed men was marching briskly through the city streets towards the university. It was a lucky thing for him that the patrol did not meet the dog catcher en route, for soldiers are very fond of dogs, and they do not like the civil authority in any guise. But it was an even luckier thing that the patrol met me. Had it not done so, there might have been memorable deeds done in Kingston on that day. I cannot believe that the students would have stood by idly while the medical building was put to the torch, and it is almost certain that the chief of police would have flung his forces into the fray on the students' side. Reinforcements would have then been required from the fort, and these might even have been included as the 2 light field pieces, relics of the Boer War, but still capable of making dangerous noises, which stood in front of the officers' mess. In a sense, I am sorry that I interfered and prevented all that, but interfere I did. Astride my borrowed bicycle, I caught up with father and the squad while they were still about a quarter of a mile from the university gates and informed them Mutt had been found. As for Mutt, when we dragged him out from under the dock where he had been closeted with a dead whitefish for the 2 hours past, he could not for the life of him understand my father's attitude. Mutt never did like being shouted at. He sulked for days.